The first time I really noticed my neighbor was the morning my grocery bag split open on the front steps of my building and a tin of chickpeas rolled all the way down the icy walkway and into the street. I was already late. I'd been up since 5 trying to finish a cost analysis report my soon to be ex husband at that point, had decided was suddenly my responsibility alone, even though we'd built that consulting file together over 2 years. I was wearing the wrong coat for the cold, my hair was still wet, and I was standing there watching a tin of chickpeas slide toward a storm drain on Elgin Street like it was the most accurate metaphor for my life I'd ever witnessed. He came around the corner of the building with his dog, a big, gray shepherd mix, the kind that looks like it was designed by someone who took the concept of a dog very seriously. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched the tin hit the curb, then walked over, picked it up, and brought it back to me. "Freezing rain last night," he said. "The whole front walk is a sheet." "I noticed," I said. He handed me the chickpeas. I noticed his hands. He wasn't wearing gloves, which I found strange, and he had a scar along the outside of his left forearm that disappeared under his sleeve. He didn't introduce himself. Neither did I. He just nodded, and his dog looked at me with enormous patience, and they walked on. I stood there on the steps of my building for a moment longer than I needed to, holding my chickpeas, and I thought, I have absolutely no idea what comes next. 3 months before that morning, my husband had sat me down at the kitchen table in our house in the Glebe and told me he wanted a divorce. He was calm about it. That was the thing I keep coming back to. How calm he was, like he had rehearsed it. Like he had given it the same efficient preparation he gave his quarterly reports at the firm. He even had a folder. We had been married for 4 years. We had been trying for a baby for the last 2.5 of them. Trying and failing and trying again and seeing specialists at the Ottawa Fertility Center on Argyle and filling out forms and having conversations in small beige rooms with people who spoke to us in careful tones. The conclusion after all of that was that the problem was likely mine. Unexplained subfertility, they called it, which is a very clean phrase for something that felt like it was slowly taking something from me every single month. My husband, I'll call him by what he was, which is a man who had already decided, had signed a prenuptial agreement before our wedding. His family's idea. His mother had been very particular about it. I'd signed it without a lawyer of my own because I was 28 and I loved him, and I thought that made the paperwork irrelevant. The agreement was not generous. In the event of a divorce before 5 years of marriage, I was entitled to a fixed settlement of $12,000 and nothing else. No share of the house, no spousal support, no stake in the consulting practice we had technically built together, though his name was the only one on the incorporation documents. $12,000. We were 4 years and 2 months in. He pushed the folder across the table. I remember staring at the label on it. He'd actually printed a label that said, "Settlement Documents," and thinking that I should feel something loud. Rage, maybe, or tears. But I just felt very, very still. I signed. I don't know why I signed. I think I was in shock, and I didn't understand that I didn't have to, that I could have called a lawyer, that the agreement might have had holes in it given the nature of our work together. I think I was also exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with that night. I'd been exhausted for 2.5 years. He gave me 6 weeks to find a new place. In Ottawa, in January, that is not a lot of time. I found an apartment on the second floor of a low-rise on the edge of Centretown. Older building, the kind with a laundry room in the basement that smells like the 1980s and radiators that tick through the night like a clock that hasn't decided what time it is. The rent was within what I could manage on my own, barely, once I'd restructured my freelance work. I brought almost nothing from the house. My clothes, my books, my grandmother's quilt, a small watercolor print of the St. Mondo. Lawrence, I'd bought at a market in Kingston the summer before everything started falling apart. My neighbor, the one with the gray shepherd, lived in the unit directly across the hall. I didn't know this at first. I'd only seen him outside. Then one evening, about 2 weeks after I moved in, I was carrying a box of files up from my car and I fumbled with my keys at the door, and his door opened and he was just there, in socked feet, looking like he'd been about to go get his mail. "Need a hand?" he said. "I'm fine," I said, which was not entirely true. The box was heavy and one corner of it was cutting into my forearm. He held the door open anyway. I went through. He didn't offer again. That was the thing about him. I came to understand. He offered once. If you said no, he accepted it. He didn't push, didn't hover, didn't make you feel that saying no was an inconvenience to him. Most people, when they offer help and you decline, look faintly wounded. He just nodded and moved on. His name was Callum. I learned this from the mailboxes in the front lobby. C. Adair, Apartment 2B. He had a small whiteboard on his door that sometimes had things written on it, though I never asked about it. Once it said out until Thursday. Once it said dog has vet, back by noon. I found this charming and said nothing about it. His dog's name, I eventually learned, was Rue. Spring came. The divorce was finalized in March. I remember sitting in my car outside the law office on Metcalf Street afterward. I'd gotten a lawyer eventually, a woman recommended by my best friend who had done what she could with the prenup but could not perform miracles, and I didn't cry. I just sat there for a long time with the engine running, looking at the parking meter, thinking about nothing in particular. My best friend called while I was sitting there. She wanted to come over, bring food, make me talk about it. I told her I was fine. She told me I always said that. I told her I'd call her later and I didn't. I went home. Callum was in the hallway, coming back from a run with Rue. He looked at me, just looked for a moment, and said, "You okay?" "Not really," I said, which surprised me because I hadn't said that to anyone. "Okay," he said. He didn't ask why. He didn't tell me it would be fine. He just said okay, like it was useful information, like he was noting it and tucking it away. I went inside and made tea and sat on my grandmother's quilt on the floor and let myself feel it, finally, all of it, in the way I hadn't been able to in the lawyer's office or at the kitchen table in the Glebe or in any of the beige rooms on Argyle. I cried for a long time. Rue scratched at my door sometime around 9 o'clock. I opened it and found a container of soup on the mat, the kind from the Lebanese place on Somerset that I had mentioned in passing approximately once, and no note. He was not in the hallway. His door was closed. I brought the soup in and ate it sitting on the floor and thought, this is the strangest kindness anyone has ever shown me. We started talking more after that, not in a planned way. We shared a narrow hallway and the rhythms of our lives started to overlap. I worked from home most mornings. He seemed to come and go at odd hours, and Rue needed 2 walks a day, which meant our paths crossed regularly at the front door of the building. He didn't volunteer much about himself, and I didn't ask. I knew he'd been in the military. I'd seen the way he moved, not aggressively, just with a kind of deliberate economy, like someone trained to be efficient with their body. I knew he had a sister he talked to on the phone sometimes in the hallway, a warm conversation he'd have leaning against the wall, laughing at something she said. I knew he drank his coffee black and sometimes read on a small folding chair on the front steps with Rue lying across his feet. I told him more than he told me. This wasn't by design. He was simply an unusually good listener, the kind who didn't fill silences with reassurances, who asked small, precise questions that somehow led you to say more than you'd planned. I told him about the prenup. I told him about the fertility stuff, not everything, but the shape of it. I told him that I'd been a co-author on 3 of the firm's largest client engagements, and my name appeared nowhere in any of the documentation. He listened. He didn't express outrage or offer advice. He asked once if I had copies of the original client correspondence. I said yes, I had everything on my own laptop. He nodded slowly. Good, he said. That was all. My ex-husband called me in June. This was unexpected. We had not spoken since the settlement was finalized, and I had not expected to hear from him again in any context that wasn't administrative. He said he was calling to let me know he'd heard I was still telling people in our professional circle that I had worked on the Pembridge account. He said it was creating confusion. He said he hoped I understood that professionally it would be better for both of us if I didn't misrepresent my involvement. I stood in my kitchen with my phone and felt something in my chest go very cold. I hadn't misrepresented anything. I had simply answered honestly when colleagues asked what I'd been working on for the past 3 years. I didn't say anything. He took my silence as compliance, I think, because he said, "Thank you, I appreciate your understanding," and ended the call. I sat down on my kitchen floor, not for dramatic effect. My legs just stopped cooperating. Callum knocked on my door 20 minutes later to return a phone charger I'd left in the hallway. He took one look at me. I was still on the floor, which in retrospect was fairly telling, and said, "What happened?" I told him. He sat down on my kitchen floor too, his back against the cabinets, and listened to the whole thing. Then he was quiet for a moment. "He called you," he said, "because something reminded him you exist professionally, something recent." I looked at him. "What does that mean?" He looked back, and there was something careful in his expression. "It might not mean anything," he said. I would think about that exchange for a long time afterward. In August, I found out I was pregnant. I sat with this information for 3 days before I told anyone. I kept taking the tests, 4 of them, from 2 different pharmacies because I did not entirely believe the results. After 2.5 years of being told my body was doing something wrong, the idea that it had quietly decided to do something right felt like information that had been delivered to the wrong address. I called my best friend on the 3rd day. She screamed, actually screamed, into the phone and then apologized and then screamed again. "Are you happy?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. "I think I'm terrified," I said. "But yes, I think yes." Callum found out the way he found out most things about me. I told him, standing in the hallway, because our hallway had somehow become the place where I said true things. He went still in a way I'd come to recognize, the particular stillness that meant he was taking something in carefully. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I keep asking myself that," I said. "That's a different question than yes or no," he said. "I know," I said. He nodded. Then he said very quietly, "You're going to be fine at this." I don't know why that particular sentence undid me the way it did. I'd had people tell me I'd be a great mother, that everything happened for a reason, that this was wonderful news. He didn't say any of those things. He said I'd be fine at this, like it was a practical assessment, like he'd observed something in me and reached a conclusion. It felt more true than the rest of it put together. What I didn't know, what I had no framework for knowing, was that Callum Adair was not simply a veteran who lived across the hall and read on the front steps and made soup appear outside my door. I found out the way I imagine most people find out things they should have seen coming, gradually, then all at once. The first piece was my best friend calling me in September to say she'd been at a fundraising dinner for the Children's Hospital and had heard Callum's name mentioned. She'd asked around. Apparently, he had donated a significant amount to the hospital's pediatric neurology wing the previous year. Significant as in his name was on a wall. I filed this away and didn't examine it too closely. The second piece was an article in the Ottawa Business Journal that a former colleague sent me about a private equity group that had quietly acquired 3 mid-sized consulting firms over the past 18 months. The group's principal was listed as a C. Adair, formerly of the Canadian Armed Forces, currently based in Ottawa. I read this sitting at my kitchen table with my tea going cold. The third piece was my ex-husband calling me again in October. This time his voice was different, tighter, with something underneath it that I might have called fear if I'd thought him capable of it. He said someone had been asking questions about the Pembridge account, about the Hartwell engagement, about the incorporation documents for the firm. He said he didn't know who it was, but he'd been told it was connected to a due diligence process for a potential acquisition and it was thorough. He said, "Is there anything you want to tell me?" I said, "No." he said, because if someone has been feeding information to a competitor or a buyer. I haven't spoken to anyone about your firm, I said. Which was true. I hadn't needed to. I had just answered honestly back in June when I told Callum I had everything on my laptop. I hung up and sat very still in my kitchen for a long time. Then I walked across the hall and knocked on Callum's door. He opened it. He looked at me. Rue came and pressed her large gray head against my hip. You bought a firm, I said. He didn't deny it. I bought a stake in a firm, he said. I'm considering a full acquisition. My ex-husband's firm. A firm that appears to have significantly misrepresented its intellectual assets, he said carefully, by failing to attribute work to the people who actually produced it. I stared at him. How long have you known? I suspected something the first time you told me about the Pembridge account, he said. The way you described it. The detail. People don't remember projects that way unless they built them. Callum. You didn't ask me to do anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. You didn't ask. That's not. I stopped. This isn't about me. You can't make a multi-million-dollar business decision because of. It's a sound investment, he said. The firm has real assets. They've just been managed badly. He paused, and possibly fraudulently, depending on what the documentation review turns up. I stood in his doorway for a long moment. Rue leaned harder against my hip. Why? I said finally. He looked at me for a long time. Because quiet doesn't mean weak, he said, and I find that people sometimes need to be reminded of that. The acquisition closed in November. I was 7 months pregnant by then, large and slow and prone to sitting on my kitchen floor, for reasons that had less to do with grief and more to do with the fact that the floor was cool and my ankles had opinions. My ex-husband called one final time. He had clearly been told by his lawyer not to call, but he called anyway, which told me something about his emotional state. He said he wanted to understand how this had happened. He said he didn't see what any of this had to do with me. He said my name was going to come up in the asset review, and he hoped I understood that it wasn't personal. What had happened with the incorporation documents, it was just how these things were structured. I know, I said. Then you understand. I understand that you structured it deliberately, I said. I understand that you knew what you were doing when you put my name on none of it. I signed the prenup without a lawyer because I was 28 and I trusted you, and you knew that too. I paused. I'm not angry anymore. I want you to know that, but I'm not going to pretend it was an accident. Silence. The asset review found my correspondence on the Pembridge account, I said. My emails, my drafts, my analysis, they're dated. Another pause. I kept everything. He hung up. I put the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment. Outside the window, the first real snow of the season was coming down over Centretown, the quiet kind that muffles everything, that makes the city feel like it's holding its breath. My daughter was born in January at the Ottawa Hospital on Smythe Road in a snowstorm that had the highways closed from Kingston to Gatineau. My best friend made it, arriving 40 minutes before the birth with her coat covered in snow and her eyes wild. My mother drove in from Perth and sat in the waiting room for 6 hours and cried when she held her granddaughter. Callum was in the waiting room too. I hadn't asked him to be. I'd texted him at 2 in the morning when the contractions were coming every 8 minutes. Just to tell him I was heading to the hospital because we had an arrangement about Rue. He texted back, I've got Rue. Do you need a drive? I said I was taking a cab. He came anyway. He sat in the waiting room with my mother apparently, and they talked for 3 hours, and by the time I was out, my mother was showing him photographs from her phone and calling him dear. My daughter was 7 pounds 4 ounces. She had my grandmother's ears and a look of profound skepticism that I chose to interpret as intelligence. I named her Ivy, which I had decided on months before, sitting on my kitchen floor with my grandmother's quilt across my lap, thinking about things that were small and persistent and grew in the direction of light. I moved into Callum's apartment when Ivy was 3 months old. This was not dramatic. It was practical, and then it was true, and then it was something I couldn't imagine having happened any other way. He had renovated the second bedroom. He'd done most of it himself, on weekends, while I sat in my apartment across the hall and pretended I didn't know what the sawdust smell meant. He'd put up the same pale yellow I'd described to my best friend once when she'd asked what color I would paint a nursery if I ever had one. I had not described this to Callum. He had, I can only conclude, asked my best friend, who had then apparently kept it to herself, while smiling at me in a way I now retroactively understand. Rue was already devoted to Ivy in the quiet, total way of dogs who have decided a person is important. She slept outside the nursery door. She learned very quickly not to bark when the baby was sleeping. She positioned herself between Ivy's bouncer and the front door at all times like a large gray ambassador. The asset review concluded the following spring. My professional contributions to the three major accounts were formally documented and recognized. The firm, under new management with significant structural changes, offered me a consulting role. I declined. I had started building something of my own by then, small and careful, and I preferred it. My ex-husband sold his stake back at a considerable loss and relocated to Calgary. I know this not because I kept track of him, but because my industry is small and people talk and my best friend has the instincts of a very cheerful intelligence operative. There is a farmer's market on Lansdowne Avenue on Saturday mornings when the weather permits, which in Ottawa means roughly from May to October. Callum and I go most weekends, Ivy in the carrier on his chest and Rue on a leash beside me, moving through the stalls of early produce and fresh bread and local honey while Ivy stares at everything with that expression of fascinated skepticism that is entirely her own. A woman stopped me there last summer. She'd recognized me from the asset review story, which had run in the business journal, a small item, just a paragraph, but enough that a few people had seen it. She wanted to know how I'd managed it, how I'd gotten there, from where I'd been. I thought about it honestly, the way I try to do with most things now. I stopped pretending I was fine when I wasn't, I said, and I let someone be quiet next to me for long enough that I remembered what I actually was. She looked a little uncertain, like she'd been hoping for a more actionable answer. Callum was at the next stall, pretending to deliberate over two types of local cheese with the gravity of a man making a consequential decision. Ivy had one fist wrapped in his collar and was explaining something to him in the urgent, vowel-heavy language of a 10-month-old. He was listening to her with complete seriousness. I watched them for a moment. Also, I said to the woman, keep everything on your own laptop, every email, every draft, everything. She nodded slowly. Dates matter, I said. Proof matters, and people who ask precise questions at the right time matter. I smiled, but mostly, keep your own copies. The Ottawa River was visible down the slope of the park from where we stood, wide and gray and cold in the October morning light. Rue leaned against my leg and looked out at it with me, and somewhere behind us, Ivy laughed at something Callum said, and the sound of it carried easily in the cold, clear air. Some things you don't plan. Some things you don't see coming until they're already the shape of your life. And sometimes the only honest thing you can say is that you're glad you didn't know in that frozen January morning on the front steps, when the tin of chickpeas rolled into the street and a quiet man with a gray dog handed it back to you. You're glad you didn't know how much of everything was about to begin. I think about the tin of chickpeas more than makes sense. A small, dented thing rolling down an icy walkway on Elgin Street, and a man who didn't know me picking it up without being asked. I didn't understand, that morning, that this was how the rest of my life was going to start. Not with a dramatic turning point, not with a speech. With a tin of chickpeas and a gray dog and someone who offered once and didn't make it complicated. What happened to me wasn't unusual. People sign documents they shouldn't. People trust the wrong version of someone for longer than they should. People spend years in rooms that were never actually built for them and wonder why they feel like they can't breathe. I signed a prenuptial agreement without a lawyer because I was 28 and I thought love made the paperwork beside the point. That was a failure of judgment, and I've had to be honest with myself about that. Not to punish myself. I've done enough of that. But because pretending it was only his fault would mean I couldn't learn anything from it. The thing about what Callum did, quietly, without announcing it, without asking for credit, is that it wasn't magic. It was the result of paying attention. He listened carefully. He asked the right questions. He noticed that I described the Pembridge account the way someone describes work they actually built, not work they watched someone else do. He filed that away and acted on it not because he was reckless, but because he had done the analysis and he trusted what he found. That kind of intelligence, the kind that is patient and precise and doesn't need to perform itself, is something I've tried to carry forward. I ask better questions now. I take longer before I decide. I trust the evidence over the explanation. And then there's Ivy, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, born in a snowstorm, already skeptical about everything. Raising her alone, and then not alone, but starting out that way has required a kind of endurance I didn't know I had. There were nights in that apartment on the edge of Sentry Town when I genuinely did not know how I was going to manage the next morning, let alone the next year. I managed anyway. Not because I was exceptional, but because I kept going when stopping would have been easier. That persistence, the unremarkable, unglamorous kind, is the thing I most want her to inherit. Not my particular story, just the habit of continuing. What my ex-husband did was wrong. Not in a complicated way. He structured things deliberately to protect himself and used my trust as a tool to do it. The consequence of that wasn't something I manufactured or wished for. It followed, naturally, from what he had done. The documentation existed. The emails were dated. The work was real. These things have a way of surfacing eventually if the people involved were honest when they produced them. I was honest. That mattered more than I understood at the time. I don't spend much time thinking about him now. I think about Ivy's face when Rue does something unexpected. I think about Callum at the cheese stall, deliberating with full seriousness. I think about the Ottawa River in October, wide and cold, and how the city sounds on a clear winter morning when the snow is fresh and everything is briefly, perfectly still. I kept my own copies. I told the truth about what I built. I got back up off the kitchen floor more than once and tried again. That's the whole of it, really.